Okay, welcome to Unit 5, everybody. This is the Mental Health Spectrum Crisis and Illness. A driving question that I put down below to kind of frame it is what might we see that suggests someone's mental health challenges are now an illness? It's not as simple as saying always that mental health evolves to an illness from an incident or from a crisis moment, but it often can. And so it's a helpful way of thinking about it. This is kind of one of the crucial units, and I think one of the units that students get the most excited to learn about because it really jumps into a part of mental health that people are really interested in, and it's valuable for us all to know so that we can work with ourselves and with others, family and friends, to help support and recognize what to look for. So without further ado, let's get into it. Not too much to say here. We'll just play a little game, just to warm us up and get us thinking about mental health and what's normal. So we'll do this as a bit of an example exercise, just to really iterate something important that we've kind of decoupled physical and mental well-being or physical and mental health from each other, but that they really belong together, and that we can actually think about these as being on the same mental health and physical health spectrum, just a spectrum of well-being, and that in fact you seldom have one doing really well unless they're both doing pretty well, and likewise it's very easy to have one struggling and then the other one can struggle as a result. Many people who struggle, for example, with depression see a lot of physical health challenges that go along with it. So just really trying to understand that we can't really decouple these the way that we've kind of done in society. That goes a lot with what we've talked about in the past and what Here for Peers talks about with stigma, the idea that it's fine to talk about physical challenges. If you break your leg, well, no sweat there. But if you're struggling with anxiety, well, you better not talk about it. And that decoupling has allowed for that to perseverate more than it should. And so we'll just do a little exercise to talk about how it's important to understand that these really do go together. Okay, so everybody likes a graph or a drawing, and this will be the one that we kind of work with a little bit in our class today. There's many versions of this. This is just one that I kind of like, and labeled, as you can see, the mental health spectrum. And you'll notice four key sections, and obviously, like everything else you've learned since kindergarten, green is good, red is concerning. Yes, ideally we want to be in the thriving element of mental health and of our physical health, of course. Coping is something that we move in and out of quite regularly when we have stressful moments in our lives. Even people with really good overall mental health are going to be moving into coping temporarily. Staying in coping and moving into struggling is where we start to see uh, continual challenges and a buildup of challenges that start to need attention. We'll talk about this a little bit when we talk about the water bucket on the next slide, about how we need to make sure that we don't get stuck in coping or struggling. And unwell is probably the easiest way of thinking about what it looks like when somebody has moved from a mental health challenge into a mental health challenge or a mental health issue into a mental health perhaps crisis moment. Not every mental health illness will have a crisis moment, but many will. And then eventually a mental illness is where somebody is now at a point where they're going to be able to be diagnosed. And we are going to talk about diagnosis a little bit in this unit and a lot in Unit 6. Um, I think the spectrum is helpful for us to really have a point of reflection so that people can actually step back and say, like, well, where am I right now and where am I normally? And it's something we don't do as a human species very often, reflection. But we can all do more of this. I think it's really important to understand that you need to be able to ask yourself, or you need to be able to ask others, questions that are going to help unlock where somebody is. It's not as obvious where somebody might be with their mental health as just being able to point to it and be like, oh, yeah, no, it's clearly struggling. I just know it. Well, no, there's questions we can ask, and there's things that we can work out to be able to determine how we might know that somebody's in that place. So we're going to generate some questions in class. An example might be something like, have you noticed you're sleeping less than normal? Okay, well, it sounds like yes. So that's going to have me thinking maybe you're a little further down the line than you were otherwise. Or are you finding that you're less interested in being with your friends? Okay, well, that might, in the element of thinking about depressive disorders, help me understand that somebody's a little further down the line. Okay. Okay, so it wouldn't be a good mental health leadership class unless we had a reference to Here for Peers, and we sure do, because I think the bucket, as is kind of crucial in the Here for Peers presentation, is also really important in us understanding the mental health spectrum. We're going into this in our class in much more depth than we do with Here for Peers, but this key idea is really something that we can build from. Understanding that all of us have a bucket to our brains, and just like as we talked to with the kids, they are, whether we like to admit it or not, different sizes for different people, different capacities. Our ability to manage stress and to be able to release stress is going to be different. Some people need more calming skills than others. That's something we don't talk about with the grade sevens, but the reality is that some people are able to bounce back more easily. Some of that is really genetic, and some of it is also going to be instilled from the from our background and our biography and kind of how we got to that moment in time. Some people will need to release more for certain challenges, and other things might not cause them to need as many calming skills and releases. So just really understanding that everybody's different, the buckets are different, how we release and our capacity and how we manage stress is all different. And I put a little question on the bottom there just about how we think Western medicine has done in supporting mental health. We'll talk about that a little bit in class. It's fair to say, no matter how you feel about it, I think that it's a less it's a more underdeveloped part of medicine than physical health has had. It's been one that's been more difficult to gain access to, and the brain is an incredibly complicated thing. Um, so we'll talk about that a bit in class. So we'll watch this video in class, but I will ask the students watch it ahead of time. I'll put the link to this one um, in the YouTube video comments as well, so it's easy to find. Um, but essentially, this is just as you can see, 2-minute neuroscience video that's looking at sympathetic and parasympathetic um, parts of our brain and our body and how they interact with each other. And it's it's when they fall out of sync and when they are not working together, and when one is being dominated over the other, that we find we often get challenges with our mental health. So the video helps explain a few key parts. Some of it is going to be from the reptilian parts of our brain, and some of it's going to be limbic. Not much of it's going to be cognitive. These are some of the most ingrained and aged elements of our brain and body that are the most important to our survival. Okay, so this slide comes from, as you can see, DBT, and if you haven't heard that acronym before, or you just forgot for a moment, this is a dialectical behavioral therapy. It's kind of related, although they probably wouldn't like me to say this, to cognitive behavioral therapy. There is a lot of overlap there, and it is one of the most strongly used and currently recommended in Western cultures, in particular, forms of therapy for working with clients. You can kind of see a bit of a map on the right or a graph on the right that talks about some key elements. There's 4 of them to DBT. There's 2 in particular that I want to talk about today because they really speak to understanding how we can move on that mental health spectrum and how somebody is able to manage. If you remember back to it, we had right from thriving into coping into struggling, right, and then all the way into the red zone. Um, what these 2 in particular say, and their distress tolerance and emotional regulation, is basically how we are able to manage ourselves when we face challenge. DBT comes from the place of understanding that all human beings are going to have moments where they're going to struggle. Some will have moments in their life, depending on how they were brought up or what their luck was or what part of the world they were born in, will have more or less of this. But we're all going to have elements of this. And people who are able to withstand moving further down the mental health spectrum, moving towards the real distressful red zone, the ones that are able to avoid that the most are going to be ones that have skills in distress tolerance and in emotional regulation. So distress tolerance, just to quickly say, is basically your ability to persevere through challenging moments. It's kind of the it's the part where you can get through a particularly challenging moment. So let's say you're having to watch a scary movie. I use this as an example because I hate scary movies. It's just not my thing. Um, and I start feeling stress or start feeling some anxiousness coming up in my chest, and I notice it in my breathing and my heart rate if I'm watching a scary movie, and I think, oh God, I just want to close my eyes, or I just want to leave the room. I want to get out of here. I want to get out of here. If I'm able to work through that with skills, which is a big part of what DBT does, if I'm able to tolerate the distress, literally just using the words to define the words, if I'm able to tolerate the distress, that improves my ability to be able to avoid going further down the spectrum. Now, I'm using this as a one off example. People who are struggling are going to be facing this regularly and constantly. Um, People who are struggling the most with their mental health are regularly being asked or forced into situations that require them to face the things that are the most challenging for them all the time. I don't need to tell people who have diagnoses about this; they already know this. But for those who don't, this is an important way of understanding it: is that um, it's the continual challenges that are just like, I think of them like waves just coming over and over and over, having to face fears, having to face anxiousness, having to face mental health issues over and over again. So a person's ability to tolerate those distresses is going to be a huge element in whether or not they're able to stop themselves from moving further down the spectrum. Likewise, emotional regulation is the ability to essentially put yourself in a different situation from the thing that's causing you stress. It also can often happen in the moment, but also happens before the moment and can happen after. So, this is the ability to regulate your body, both physically and mentally, and regulate your emotions. A lot of this can be like distraction. A lot of this can be breathing. A lot of this happens with mindfulness. A lot of this is, I'm recognizing right now that my heart rate's going up. I'm recognizing right now that I'm really upset about this. I'm recognizing right now that my thoughts and feelings are not real or rational in this situation, and then I'm going to breathe through this, and I'm going to talk through this, and I'm going to be able to get through this, as an example. So emotional regulation is just the ability to keep yourself in the calmest state possible in a challenging situation. um, Distress tolerance really requires people to distress tolerance really asks people to be able to recognize where they're at. Emotional regulation asks people to be able to weather the storm. These things, as you can kind of imagine, go hand in hand. Okay, so that's two halves of, or sorry, that's two quarters of DBT in the simplest forms, and how they work with the mental health spectrum. Okay, so we'll do an activity here that really kind of brings a lot of what we're talking about for when you can recognize somebody's struggling with mental health. And this is using a baseline activity. Baselines are great because, as we talked about with the Here for Peers bucket slide, everybody's capacity for managing challenging emotions and challenging situations, and indeed managing illness, both physical and mental, is different. And so we have to understand if there's been a difference in us and in our baseline. So this can be things that include, well, as I say on the slide, sleep, for example. What differences are you noticing in the quality or the quantity of your sleep? That is a huge indicator on whether or not somebody might be moving or sliding up or down the mental health spectrum. We always think of these things in the negative, but people also could be getting better sleep, and they could be moving more towards the green zone as well. I'm going to have people guess, so I won't give too many of them now in class, and then we will do an activity where you can kind of do a baseline on yourselves. And it gives you a sense of the sorts of questions you might ask yourself or ask somebody else you care about if you feel like maybe you're noticing something and you want to be able to get more data. In understanding the mental health spectrum, data is king. Okay, so I feel like every unit we come back to the four Bs, but they have something to say about all of it. Um, just remembering Brené's four Bs and just asking, we'll talk about this a little bit in class. What do we think the four Bs might have to say about how something can move from mental health to a crisis or illness? and understanding that all of these biography, biology, behavior, backstory, they all have a role in whether or not somebody moves from green right through to red. And understanding that they all have a different effect for each person. Somebody will have much more significance with one of the B's than others. But just as a way to kind of frame what we're talking about in class. Okay, so let's say now we're in the red zone. We're in a place where we're really quite unwell. Um, we want to talk a little bit about diagnosis, and that goes through a system called pathology. So pathology, and there are, I have a friend, in fact, who's actually a pathologist, a fully trained doctor who works, in his case, and often in hospitals, and they're in charge of figuring out what is at the core of what's going on. Pathology says in the physical side, what is this? And can we figure out what strain of cancer, for example, somebody might have? Or can we figure out um, the diagnosis for what bone was broken in the foot here? It's used for disease and injury. It's also used in mental health, but it's a lot more difficult and it's a lot less precise, we know. Because again, the brain is much more complicated than other elements of our body. Um, so the pathological system is, or the system of pathology, I should really say, um, is something that's being designed, and quite brilliantly, out of Western medicine. But it does have some challenges, and we'll look at that in class. Um, so the system uses something called the Diagnostic Statistical Manual. I'll probably share the massive, it's like 700 pages, most recent version, if you, in case you're curious. We will look at it when we look at some specific illnesses as well. You will see that it's basically a way of recognizing. Um, it basically says here's what to look for to be able to diagnose somebody with blank. For example, we're in class going to look at panic disorder. There are very set criteria that must be present. Some have to be present, and some are a certain number of something have to be present. So, for example, these two must be present, and these 3 of 7 must be present. Otherwise, somebody is not diagnosable. You'll get a better sense when we look at this in class with the example. It's interesting though, and um, it's very number driven. You either check the box or you don't check the box. It's very quantitative is what I really mean to say. It does miss on some of the qualitative elements that go with mental health. Like mental health diagnoses are going to be messy. Um, but the DSM is designed to be incredibly clear cut, which then has to be interpreted by humans. These humans are doctors, and they're most commonly going to be psychologists, or sorry, psychiatrists. Psychiatrists being fully trained doctors who have the additional training in psychiatry, the studying of the brain and of mental illness. Uh, the interpretation of the DSM is massive, but it's discussed and supposed to be used as though it was being done by robots. It's a very interesting dilemma that we're faced with, and I'm not sure there's a fix to it. But we'll talk about this lots in class about how there can be some shortcomings of using the DSM, and on the other hand, it's really quite helpful for other things. Okay, so this is going back to the slide before the bell curve, just to speak a little bit more about pathology and um, the diagnosing challenges, the merits and the challenges of the DSM. So a really important thing that I'm coming back to because I want everyone to really understand, and we'll talk about this more in class, is to understand that diagnosis is about criteria. It's about recognizing what is happening for someone. The DSM does nothing purposefully. It's not designed to. It's not a failure. It's just not designed to be able to understand reasons and causes. The DSM is designed to be able to say whether somebody meets the threshold to be able to be diagnosed with something that's going on. No reasons or causes. Um, What's challenging is because in the Western culture we have such an emphasis on the importance and the power of medicine that we often think, well, if we have a diagnosis, then we have an answer. But in reality, all we really do is we're able to say what's going on for that person. We're not solving anything. I think about this a little bit like if you had a headache and you take some acetaminophen, some Tylenol, some ibuprofen, whatever you take, it goes away for a bit. You've diagnosed the headache. You've taken something to deal with it. If the headache doesn't go away because of other things you're doing 4 hours later, though, the Tylenol isn't going to do anything. You've temporarily numbed it out by diagnosing it and then doing something in the immediacy, but you haven't actually solved the headache. And so this is the risk that I want to get at with understanding that the DSM is a really helpful, important tool, but it's not everything. Right? It's like getting a diagnosis but then not doing something for your well-being, like therapy or improving your calming skills or having outlets, recognizing um, what you need to get better, and changing your food, your water, your sleep, all of these things. Um, and I think it's also important, and this is why I have this circular effect here, to understand um, that it's easy to recognize and find a diagnosis when you're looking for a diagnosis. And that it's not bad to be asking yourself, if you ever are in your life, do I meet the criteria to have a blank diagnosis? But that often it's very circular in that we look for it and then we get it. And to understand that all of these diagnoses are really need to be put into the context of what's going on. So I love this one, so I always share it. So in BC, this was from about 3 or 4 years ago, I believe, but I'm sure the data is still very accurate. If you were born in British Columbia during the month of December, you are 39% more likely to be diagnosed with ADHD than if you were born in January. Why? Well, see if you can figure it out. Okay, so this will be a group discussion we do, just talking about diagnosing the pros and the cons. Not going to say too much right now, but we'll brainstorm and then we'll talk about it. Just really trying to get at the understanding that the DSM is an important and valuable tool, but also there's more going on. Okay, this is our last slide, and I don't know for sure that we'll get to do this in class, but I'm hoping we'll be able to do this exercise. What I really want people to be able to do is to be able to help identify good questions to help get a better understanding of what might be going on for somebody. Again, understanding that diagnosis, as I've said a few times now in this presentation, um, has its merits and its value, but also doesn't give the entire picture. Um, what can we do as interested parties for ourselves or for others, for family, for friends, for people we come across in our life that we want to help? What are the questions that we can ask? What are the things that we can help people realize about themselves so that they can best get the supports that they need? If we know that diagnosis is a start, but it's not everything, this is the next step. Increasingly, as I say in the top point there, we're finding that genetics has a smaller role with emotional ailments than we used to think. So there's a couple elements to this, and I'm not even saying that I know all of them, but a couple that we do know are that, for one, while genetics very much do pass on quite often, um, biological markers that can cause things like anxiety or depression from a parent to a child, a biological child, um, we can think about this as like a switch that can be turned on, but that a person's ability to cope and manage in their life will determine whether that switch ever actually gets turned on. We also know this is true, as it's been famously studied with schizophrenia, for example. We know that some drugs will often induce a schizophrenic episode that can cause somebody to have schizophrenia for the rest of their life. But if somebody um, never medically induces that through drug use, they won't ever get it. And so it's just important to understand that a person's ability to cope and a person's ability to, going back to here for Peters here, their ability to manage their bucket and to be able to keep the waters at a low enough level, and the abilities to de-stress and to be able to recognize what's going on for them and reflect, are going to be huge factors in determining whether somebody ever reaches the point of mental health illness at the end of the spectrum, that red zone that we've been going back to a few times. So this will just be an activity that hopefully we have some time to be able to do. Okay, and that's the end of it. Mental health spectrum.